During World War II, some 12,000 men who were classified as conscientious objectors to war, about 15% of them from Pennsylvania, served in non-military occupations across the United States. Under the leadership of Mennonite, Quaker, and Church of the Brethren agencies, they were engaged in mental health care and medical experiments, in forestry and on dairy farms, and in other important civic projects.
I'm going to tell you about my family. Born in southeastern Pennsylvania, where my first ancestor came in 1732 and came from Germany, I think, with other Church of the Brethren members, and bought a farm from William Penn, and my ancestors stayed there ever since. They were always farmers, peasant-like people, and a lot of neighbors who were Mennonite, who also came from that area of Germany, and quite religious, pacifist, Anabaptist. Always never worked on a Sunday, always went to church, and so it was natural for me to become a pacifist.
Wilmer Brandt at 80 is still a pacifist. During World War II, he was a conscientious objector and served in a civilian public service camp. He spent most of his life living close to the woods and has become a dedicated forester.
Hello, you got mail for me?
I think another 15 inches I'll be able to get to the box.
I don't think you'll be able to get to it until July. All right, thank you.
Wilmer's 80th year was filled with friends and a special reunion of lifelong pacifists.
Well, people follow their traditions a lot. You know, they're molded early, and it takes a long time to get out of it. I keep wondering what kind of a person I would have been if I wasn't drafted by Uncle Sam and went to camp and exposed to a lot of different thinking. And, you know, we're a product of a lot of things that we don't design, I think. But after a certain point, then if you go in a certain direction, then you can help determine yourself by what you read. But once you're exposed to certain things, there's no turning back. You only get to be 80 once. I thought my 70th year, one never knows how long one's going to be around. So I wrote in my Christmas letter that I thought my 70th year was a milestone. I didn't know if it was going to last till I was 80. And some friends, including Joe Gainza and Lawrence and Connie Kaler and my neighbor Angela Gibbons, and they just wanted to do something for my 80th birthday, and so I said, let's go to it. There were 8 people who did it, and they organized it. And we knew we were going to do it, not just as my birthday, but as a community affair and call it social, community social, to make people also aware. It was pretty overwhelming for me because I don't know how to be a star, even though I'm getting my picture taken.
We're all so fond of you. We're half crazy to live a long life like you. It must be the walks in the forest or veggies from your garden and what you eat so little.
This is called On 8 Decades of Wilmer Brandt, composed by his many admirers. And if I have to do the first verse, so if I get the cadence wrong, then we're all really messed up. Ready?
I blame you.
Okay. At a time when so many say I can't, lives a man whom no one can supplant. He lives close to the land, he'll sure lend you a hand, the Wilmer whose last name is Brandt.
Our planet he'll always protect her from those who would ruin and reject her. His beard's a bit curled, he brings peace to this world, and he's a conscientious objector.
To our nation, he is really a plus. He works like 10 people without any fuss. He reuses egg cartons, his geese weed his garden, and there's no match for his asparagus.
On the 13th of this month, he turned 80. To his friends, the age is quite weighty. But for him, it's a start, and we know he won't part till he's done all he can and is ready.
Yes!
The world is kinder with you. We're half crazy to live a long life like you. You're the most helpful neighbor. Do anyone a favor. Your bees make honey, but not for money. Happy 80th birthday to you.
I think the thing that makes me feel best is having a lot of good friends who support the right things.
Wilmer's still in touch with friends from World War II. They met over a half-century ago as conscientious objectors, COs, in a civilian public service camp. When they left CPS camp after the war ended, they started a round-robin letter that's still circulating. This year, the COs and their wives are having a reunion in Indiana. Wilmer's neighbor, Katie, is driving out with them.
This brown suitcase has been all over the East.
Okay. Now, that's right. Put that right in there.
Hey, terrific.
And then, we'll have, because we can't pull this top back.
It was over 60 years ago that Wilmer, at 22, headed off from his family farm in Pennsylvania to the civilian public service camp in Florida. He had chosen that road when he realized war was coming.
I had the feeling through hearing news that somehow the war was inevitable. It was just a very tense time, a feeling of great uncertainty. And of course, if you listen to the radio any time, pre-war time, there's all that emotional stuff built up for the war, and so you had the feeling that the average person would have the feeling that they should join in. But I think I was able to resist because of my religious and cultural background.
The men at CPS camp all made the same decision, to conscientiously object to war as a means of resolving conflicts. Each came to that decision to follow his conscience, with or without the support of family, community, and country.
I should talk about just a little bit about articles that I read in the Saturday Evening Post, and there was a series of articles back in the 30s sometime, I don't know what part of the 30s, probably about 1934, just about the time I was graduating from high school. And it was all about World War I. And it showed pictures and it was written up and so forth. And I began to think, war is not about bravery, or if it is about bravery, it's about bravery because people want to feel like they're brave. And it's also not about glory. It showed pictures of people all in the trenches and people being shot to pieces and all that sort of thing. I know war is terrible. And so I began to think about that too, and war didn't appeal to me at all. I do realize that there are moments of decision, such things as moments of decision, And I guess my final moment of decision was, which way am I going to sign up? I knew the draft board wasn't going to be encouraging me to sign up as a CO.
But I do remember reading a magazine called Liberty, and at that, reading that, I was kind of surprised to find that a lot of young people were saying that they don't want to go to war. Of course, that all dissolved when the war actually came. And I would say, as far as my church went, there was expectation that the war was coming. And some meetings were held with the young guys who were going to be drafted. They were held by the pastor, at which he had some of the guys who were COs in World War I talk about some of their experiences. And that was sort of an introduction to us about what could happen. The pastor mentioned that once the war began, he probably would not be able to talk much about peace. He was, I think, reluctant to be outspoken about it. I was faithful in reading the Bible and taking literally Jesus' teachings, and was really shocked when, especially the one friend who went to the armed forces, went into the army. But what did it for him, he said, was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Up until then, maybe he would have been a pacifist, but that did it for him, he said. And both of those friends were killed in the war. I had a difficult time dealing with that for a number of years.
It just never seemed as though there, for me, that anything besides a pacifist position was possible. I know that for some other people, some other aspects would take priority in their thinking, either their own experiences, their own philosophy of how one deals with violence in the world, perhaps some experiences that they've had that makes them feel as though a non-resistant stance doesn't work, or perhaps a feeling as though it's not practical. And so, I think everyone has to come to this from their own perspective, after study, prayer, if that's part of their philosophy, and do what feels right. A reluctant pacifist is not a pacifist. It's really should be a way of life.
50 years ago, it's hard to, I don't know that anybody wanted war, but I think they were accepting it pretty much, that this was inevitable. And of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor clinched the thing. During this whole period, we had a young people's group that was made up from young people from several of the Quaker meetings around us. And there are 13 Quaker meetings in our county, so that we're blessed in that sense. And we used to have long discussions. And my brother and I think, were the youngest in the group. And so, I don't know, maybe 15, 16, somewhere in there. And so, took all this in, discussions and the idea of pacifism. And seemed to me, if you're a Christian, that was a logical conclusion. But it wasn't until the last couple of months before I was drafted, I'd really made up my mind.
I don't believe I ever really questioned the fact that I was not about to kill. One thing, probably impression I had was when just at the time of the Civil War in Spain, every night I'd be glued to the radio to hear the war news in Spain, and my mother was extremely upset about it. She finally said in Swiss, die verdammte Krieg, which meant the damned war. And in Swiss it even seemed to be stronger than when he said in English, the totally complete damnation of war. And that somehow, I think that stuck with me. And for that reason, I just thought, well, I can't kill. I really didn't think I could.
Well, as a Baptist trained in the Baptist Sunday schools for years, all of the time I was growing up, we were told about the Ten Commandments, and I think I took them quite literally at the time, but never thought much about it being applicable to me as relates to war, of course. But I do think that it contributed to my decision that it was just the natural thing to accept it as the Word of God, and that I would therefore act accordingly. And so it wasn't much of a difficult decision for me to make. I just grew into it, I think, and chose to do that.
You have to remember that I lived near this Quaker community, a few of whom had had a very rugged time in World War I, and while I didn't know them personally, I knew of them. And so in my mind, I felt that by being a conscientious objector, I probably was putting myself at greater risk than if I had enlisted or allowed myself to be drafted into the Army. Now, that may have been, in retrospect, it was unrealistic, but at that time, with the data I had to deal with, I think it was realistic. And so my thought was not so much the religious injunction that thou shalt not kill, although I agreed with that heartily, but rather, if I'm going to lose my life, do I want to lose it for nationalism, or do I want to lose it for planethood? And I opted for planethood. And now that's not a very good basis for getting yourself classified. But I know when we signed up for the draft, as yet there was no provision in sight for what's going to happen to conscientious objectors, and there was no blank on your signing up to indicate your intentions. So you had to write on the front of the card over and put on the back of it that I intend to be a conscientious objector.
Welcome. Good to see you. How you doing? Good.
Hi, Jack.
Well, how are we doing?
Yeah,
we still
doesn't seem like
still on the map a little bit.
Right here we are, a bunch of 80-year-olds and older, and when we get together, we're going to have a lot to talk about. Each of us are doing many different interesting things and have a lot of catch-up to do, and a lot of sharing, and a lot of enthusiasm to see what each other was doing.
Now, to tell how the day is going to be arranged, the morning is going to be arranged. The first session is supposed to be on the most meaningful events that have occurred in your life. And that can go all the way back to the beginning, to the present time.
Well, in college, I suppose a book was quite important to me. It was a little book full of photographs. It was called The Horror of It, and it was about war, of course. And it didn't scare me out of war in a squeamish sense. I think I could have stood that. I was kind of a rough and ready sort of guy. But it stressed that all these atrocities that they were picturing in this book were true. But all the atrocities that the Allies had committed in World War I were also true. And we didn't pay attention to that, you know. Yeah. So that made me think that this war business is no good.
After having a few jobs, I decided to escape into the wilderness. Vermont land was, I say, dirt cheap. You could buy it for $5 to $10 an acre. If I'd had a lot of money, I probably would have bought the whole state. It seemed like a good deal. And, but I didn't have any money. It was mostly in debt. But I was able to buy a few hundred acres, and I puttered around doing that and encouraging other people to buy land so I could manage it for them. And a few people did. And so that kept me busy for about 10 years until I moved to Marshfield, which was a little closer to civilization and closer to Montpelier, where there's more intellectual activity and further away from the Republican state of New Hampshire. And so that was progress. That was very significant. And I think just living in that area of Vermont and just participating in community activities and discovering more wonderful people in that area, and watching Vermont grow from a Republican to a Democratic state. I think that was some of the highlights, and just seeing all the people there who were working for social betterment. I don't think I've seen it happen any better anywhere. And we have our one lone congressman who now claims to be an independent, but he's a democratic socialist, and which you can't describe in a few short sentences. He really works hard for the welfare of the people, and he's a strong person with a good voice and bold person, and works hard. But I think probably the final thing that influenced my life presently is living in Vermont.
Probably the best decision I ever made, although it wasn't determined to go CPS, but just deciding I can't kill. And that was that. And so after 2 interviews with the draft board, they decided I really wouldn't go into the armed forces, and gave me the 4E classification. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And thus I ended up in CPS. And there my horizon was tremendously expanded, having been lived in a small town and never having traveled anywhere, and being exposed to a whole lot of different ideas, people from different places and even different races, and spent, I guess I'd say maybe 2 years just listening to that and not saying anything, just trying to absorb, figure out what's going on, and then finally reading enough and listening enough to gain some understanding of what the world was like and what maybe it could be like, how it could be changed. And thus the CPS experience was just a tremendous thing for me. And thanks to Bob Rohrer, ended up going to college.
Officials say that those who suffer the most in war are the innocent. And this brought to mind again an experience I had in dealing with refugees as they came to Paraguay. It was amazing to see the women and girls. Almost 90% of the refugees were women and girls. as they came to Paraguay, it was necessary for them to establish new homes in a land. Language was totally foreign to them, but also they had to start homesteading in the woods, in a forest. These were the women and their girls that did this. They had to build their homes. And I saw what war did in a way that I had never possibly been able to experience before. I knew there was a war going on while I was in civilian public service for 4.5 years, doing work of national importance, but that just made all that I'd done before very minimal in my life experience. And this has been a great influence in my life to know how people actually suffer in time of war, an experience that we cannot imagine unless we actually see the results of war, the refugees, and the innocent are the ones that suffer.
May I ask where the refugees came from?
The refugees were refugees out of Russia. They followed the German army out of Russia, wagons, wagon trails, horses, and on the way they would sometimes experience machine gun fire. Some would be killed, but they had to keep on going. The dead would have to lay, and they'd have to keep on going. And so it was through the Mennonite Central Committee. These were mostly Mennonites who had fled out of Russia, and they were being settled in Paraguay.
We need a break. Break.
11:30. Okay.
All of them can improve that. I think that was called June. Moon Water, Galen, yeah. Ed Sauer, yeah. Time Girl, yeah. Can you spot the word?
This is excellent. This is, I wondered about it. I knew he'd taken pictures, but I never seen parents in it.
Yeah, but I cooked on that little thing. I wasn't to be the cook, but somebody had to cook.
And I think Ray knows that answer.
I was in 4 different camps, but I never made the friendships, the lasting friendships that I had with this group. At the time CPS was set up, the idea was that we would be trained for overseas relief work. And that was the whole intention, that we would go overseas. And they actually had a couple of camps where they're training fellows to go overseas. And then some representative came up with a rider on an appropriation bill that said no COs could go overseas, and that put a damper on the whole thing. And changed the whole, I think, changed the whole complex of what CPS was, because it was, an awful lot of it was made work, not really significant. So a lot of it was significant. I think this project in Florida was the Hookworm Project. I'd never been in a place before where people didn't have a bathroom, and let alone a privy. A lot of those people didn't even have privies. They just went out in the woods. And so this was an attempt to break the cycle of the hookworm. Because either you give them shoes, this is where the hookworm enters the body, between the toes usually, or you give them privies. And you give them a pair of shoes, they're going to last 6 months or a year, and then they're barefoot again. So the privy was the solution, and I think we accomplished quite a bit.
I had a lot of corners rubbed off. First I had corners rubbed off. I'm this little town guy from a little conservative church, and I go to this little college, which has got students from different backgrounds. So I get some corners that's Presbyterian oriented. I go to CPS and there's all kinds of backgrounds. And as I'm sure others have said, there was one common thread among CPSers, and that's resistance to war. We could differ on other things and did differ on other things in lifestyle, and one thread common.
Being around people with many different points of view about war realizing there are other reasons than religious for being opposed to war, and realizing all the things that need to be done, that can be done, and realizing that no, anybody can do something. And what it is going to be different for different people, thank goodness. Not everybody should be doing the same thing. And it's just opened up just another whole world out there that I didn't know existed.
I thought I was going into a community of saints and wound up in quite a different situation, and it went through a shocking experience at that time, thinking that do I even belong here? What a mixture of people and dispositions and avocations and things like that. I mean, it was a startling experience, completely upsetting in many ways. I was always in Church of the Brethren camps, which had a tradition of pacifism, but my next in the bed next to me was I don't know how he got his conscientious objector thing, but he had been a linesman for the electric light company south of Chicago. There was one man who was brilliantly educated. He was head of all the social services for the Polish people in Chicago, which is more than were in Warsaw. There were many, many rural people who I identified with. There was a strange guy who was a radio continuity officer, whatever that meant, from Iowa. And we had one guy that we didn't know until later who had collected about all the local snakes and had them under his couch, you know.
Oh, it affected my life in lots of ways. And one was to open my mind to new ways of thinking. That there were other ways of thinking besides just follow the Bible and do what your religion said because it said it was what it was supposed to be. In other words, follow the religious dogmas. And I began to question some of that, and I began to also realize that it's human beings that have made all this happening, really. So I'm a humanist.
As you can see with the meetings we've been having here these last couple of days, why we've had a great time together then, and even more so the social aspect of it now that camp was over. And we started out with some years, I guess it was, after leaving camp with a round-robin letter that went around to about 25 of the people that were in one particular dormitory, at least, with a scattering of others from the other dorms. And that round-robin letter has gone these 50-some years. Well, not all of the time, because it started a little late, but it's carried through all of the later years.
The experience of CPS and everything connected with it leaves a psychological scar that it takes quite a while to outgrow. And as you can tell, I don't suffer from lack of ego now, but I did for a while.
Yeah. I have an idea, a vague idea what it is to be a minority. I was white, so I could pass, but everybody wants to know why you're not in a uniform, and the response isn't always very pleasing. Yeah. The interesting thing is, when I was on the West Coast as a firefighter in CPS, oftentimes if the fire was too big for the camp to handle, they would pull in the military. And I never had a conflict with those fellows. Some had returned from overseas, had been there a while and come back, and most of them were recruits going over. But I can't recall, and I think I'm accurate, that never did I have anybody who really challenged my views on this. The only ones who challenged me were the fellows who had exemptions. The farmers that we'd run into, and the fellow, I forget what they call them, they B1 or something like that, what the classification was, but they weren't sick enough to be 4Fs, which was deferment because of physical disability, but they weren't well enough to go overseas, and they used them as bridge guards and something like that. Those guys were very hostile because they were safe.
I started giving up.
78,
You know, I began to unroll
His
that.
brother was a preacher. Well, then his brother did.
Fires that were just like that because I was wearing pictures.
Yeah.
So that's Bill Marston.
I've
been curious. No, you went to
Right now, I'll read from what Dot and Mel proposed in the solicitation of topics. They said that we could have a narrow topic: globalism, capitalism, environmentalism, democracy, religion, and the poor. I thought that wasn't adequate, so I added, maybe we could add learning to live with a growing Islamic population, racism, world population problems, economic inequality, merger mania, media monopoly, and radon in the basement.
Narrows it down.
In our spare time.
So with that, we'll let Dot and Mel get as much as they can out of us on as many of those topics as possible.
I would like to, with your permission, suggest that I make a certain assumption. And the certain assumption relates to a new $5 word that I just learned. And if I'm pronouncing it correctly, meliorism, meliorism. And I'd like to read you the shorter Oxford dictionary of what that means. It is the doctrine that the world may be made significantly better by rightly directed human effort.
They say we don't know all the answers to how you start working to build peace, a culture of peace. We've had military academies, military schools by the score, but list, if you will, the peace academies, the peace schools. We're just starting to learn how. And it's a little like when Edison came out with his first little light bulb. That may be about where we are at how to build a culture of peace.
The whole thing is that there are ways to get at helping people before we get to the situation where stresses and conflicts do arise. And I think that in the long run, that is the more important way to go. And we are, in a sense, trying to find ways that will make it possible so that we can say we are truly doing the Old Testament prophecy of beating our tanks or our submarines into windmills and our rockets into fuel cells. We can do things that are so capable of accomplishing the needed things. And then if you look at that on the long view of how do we do it, if those windmills can be placed in Tibet and India and the middle of the Australian desert or Sahara Desert for that matter, the energy is there. Those winds cannot be harnessed by the power companies of the world simply because they can't put a fence around the sun or the wind. It is there for people to use.
For the Republican convention, there are a lot of the groups in Philadelphia, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Quakers, and even political groups were involved in teaching of nonviolence. And interestingly enough, the people that are getting the police attention
for nonviolent training are the gay and lesbian organizations in Philadelphia, and they now have access to the police academy, and that has become part of the new police going into the force. They go through this doctrinaire training provided by the gay and lesbian groups, not the church groups. And it's interesting how the concept of nonviolence has become acceptable in some sections of society, way beyond the concept anything to do with religion or ethics. It's a new morality.
I'm thought a lot about this, and I sort of come to the conclusion that just as we need a police force locally, we need a police force internationally, and that it needs to be a voluntary police force, maybe under the United Nations. The way it is now, I think the United States has too much control under the present setup when they send troops in to act as policemen. They have this veto power, and if we don't like what they're doing, why we pull them out. And oftentimes we found that was a mistake. And so I like the idea of a voluntary police force to control these situations, and I think they can be controlled that way.
I don't know how relevant it is, but one time on the farm, and I guess this was after I was in my 20s sometime, we had a bull that didn't want to take anything from people if he could help it. And one time this bull challenged me, and I happened to have a pitchfork in my hand, but the question was, how lethal should I be with the pitchfork in order to stop him? Well, he was going to force me to do the ultimate, and I didn't quite know what the ultimate was. And my father, who had been dealing with this bull for years in his way, was behind him, a considerable distance behind him, must have been 200 feet. And my father saw that I couldn't make up my mind whether I wanted to back up and get under a fence and slide under a fence and let the bull maybe chase me on through the fence or what. But anyway, my father saw it, and he yelled in his huge voice, and the old bull stopped and looked around and forgot all about me. That's my point, whatever it is.
Once you've thumbed your nose at society and been a rebel in CPS, there's nothing going to intimidate you again. You're willing to speak out on whatever comes to you.
I considered at one point leaving camp to resist more than I had, but it was near the end of the war, and I compromised. I knew that if I did it, I would be spending 4 more years in jail, and the war seemed to be winding down. I thought I could do more, be more valuable out of jail than in jail. So that was more of a struggle in about my 3rd year to decide which way I should go.
I did raise the question, should I be in CPS? That was when I was working in a mental hospital. And at that time, this was would have been about 2 years after the war began. In other words, about halfway through the war, maybe. A lot of the men, a number of the men from the hospital unit went into the armed forces. And at that point, I began to raise the question, well, wait a minute, should I have taken this position? And I made a list, the reason I should have taken this position, the reason I should go into the armed forces. And the reasons to go into the armed forces was long. You know, the respect you would get, the money you would get, the education you could get afterward, et cetera, et cetera. And the reasons for staying in the peace position were very brief, that I didn't believe in killing. I thought it was wrong. I thought it was against the teachings of Jesus, and that no, I couldn't kill.
I probably have even stronger convictions now than even at that time. Because of that conviction, I also felt a sort of an obligation to make up for the fact that I hadn't been in the military, and so I volunteered for voluntary service through the Mennonite Central Committee.
Had I known then, and there's no way, be very extremely unlikely, had I known then what I know now, I wouldn't have been a CO. Because I've seen that you know, there are wars and other wars, and some, unfortunately, may be necessary. The Civil War might be a case in point, the U.S. Civil War.
Pacifism, when had just never occurred to me that's who I was. But when we were getting acquainted with each other, Mel gave me some reading to do. He wanted to make sure that I understood what was involved with being a pacifist. And we had lots of discussions about it, but also in our youth, in our fellowship, the Methodist Youth Movement, in the Wesley Foundation, we had these discussions, and I did come to believe that I really was a pacifist. When he went off to the University of Chicago and had the experiences that I wasn't having, and I was working for the YWCA, as a matter of fact, and he said one day, you know, he could no longer be a pacifist. I didn't like that at all. So that was a hard time. But I find myself today really struggling because I have seen what's happened in Kosovo and some of the other countries with the killings and the genocide, and I have felt that I supported our going in there and trying to stop it. So I can't say that I'm any longer a pacifist, and yet there are other times when I'm looking for ways of resolving differences other than through violence. So that's where I am, and we don't always agree on how far, you know, where we both stand. That's okay.
I have the theory that most everybody has commingled feelings. That in my mind, yeah, maybe 40% of me said I ought to be, you know, the part of the war effort, but the other 60% prevailed. And I think the people that went to war may have had anywhere from 1 to 49% feeling that they ought to do what I did. And so to that extent, but yet sometimes it's only possible to contribute to one cause, and I chose that one.
I don't know that you would say I rethought my position so much as I was troubled and wondered how I would stand up to a situation if I was in that situation. It was easier to be a CO in the United States than it was in Germany. It was easier to speak out in the United States, even though public opinion was against you, and I realized that. Troubled, yes. Shaken in the position I would take, no. Wondering if I could stand up to my beliefs and be willing to die for my beliefs. I had to think about that. It's the old story, what would happen if? Unless you're faced directly with it, you don't know what you would do. in a given situation. And people say, I know if I was, no, you don't. You don't know until you're confronted with the situation exactly what you do. That's when you know. And I was troubled by it. And I still don't have an answer for that.
In case we don't meet again, let me say that some of us come from Walhalla, you know, up in Michigan, and others from Wellston, which was close to Manistee. So I'd like to sing you a song. And it's kind of a takeoff on the self-righteousness of CPS people. From the halls of old Walhalla to the shores of Manistee, we will plant our country's forest with 100 million trees. If the Army and the Navy ever get to heaven's rest, they will find their places occupied by the men of CPS.
If the Army and the Navy ever get to where they're bound, they will find the fire started by the trees that we cut down.
All must have had a little different version, I guess.
Oh, thank Bob.
Nice to see you.
Are we hugging?
Pacifism is a very harsh discipline because to be a pacifist conscientiously you have to be aware of the causes of war and the social effects that cause war and so on. And I think all my life that was a kind of a good and stern discipline.
The most likely scenario is that the U.S. will place very high conditions for Iraq to let weapons inspectors back in.
Wilmer Brandt's a forester, helping others care for the land. And he's a pacifist, spending his life making the world a better place for all of us.